Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully people can hear me online. My name is Ian Trim. I'm a director with Navigant, and I'm hoping that everybody who has dialed in, all 63 people that are so far online, have dialed in for the internal carbon pricing for future-proof supply chains as part of our Carbon Pricing Unlocked series. We've reached the start of the 4 o'clock, so I would propose, given how tight an agenda that we have and how packed a schedule we have to talk this through, that we kick off. And as people continually kick up in terms of the attendance list, they can join in and pick up the flow as we go through. As I started, my name is Ian Trim. I will moderate and chair the session. I'm a director with Navigant within our sustainability team. I will sit and chair the questions as they come through from the end. I would ask people when we get to the Q&A session at the end of the session to type their questions into the question box, which you should be able to see on the corner of the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll then read those out to the specific presenter. If you have a question for a specific presenter we go through, please state that as you write your question. We have a full agenda to go through. We have 4 panelists who will all talk to different elements of the subject. The first is Grace Eddy, who is Director of the Generation Foundation, who is the key sponsor for the Carbon Pricing Unlocked partnership, which is a partnership with Navigant to look at different elements of how carbon pricing could work within the economy. Second speaker is Nikki Bartlett, who is the Global Director of Climate Change at CDP. And Nikki will be looking at how different companies are picking up and the extent to which internal carbon pricing is being used by companies, with a focus on supply chains and the importance within supply chains. The next speaker is Long Lam from Navigant. Long will dive into the detail of our study, which we conducted under the Carbon Pricing Unlocked process, to look at how internal carbon pricing could be used within the supply chain process, with a focus on the different methods and processes which could be undertaken by companies to focus on that. Our last speaker is turning to where is this being used in practice, with a real practical example from Dadi Sverrisson, who's the project manager for internal carbon pricing at Landsvirkjun and from the National Power Company of Iceland. Dadi will talk through how they are looking at implementing ICP within their own. So without further ado, I will pass on to Grace, and Grace can say a little bit more about some of the focus that we've had under the Carbon Pricing Unlocked series.
Great, thanks Ian. Hi everyone, I'm Grace Eddy, the director at the Generation Foundation. And for those of you who don't know us, we're the philanthropic arm of Generation Investment Management, the sustainable investment firm founded by Al Gore and David Blood in 2004. The foundation was established alongside Generation Investment Management with the ambition to create a more sustainable economic system, one that's low carbon, prosperous, healthy, safe, and fair. We do this through our research and partnerships and through grant making. And every 3 to 5 years or so, we develop a strategy to identify where best to focus our resources to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. We underwent this process at the end of 2019 in recognition that this is the decade that will be the most important in all of our professional lives, and that we have a personal and professional responsibility to do everything that we can to pursue 2 interconnected goals. So the first is limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and the other is ensuring the fair economic system that's necessary for that global climate action. With that very tall order in mind, we identified the areas of intervention where our resources and skills were best suited, and that could meaningfully influence those impact goals. Carbon pricing was in our last strategic plan, and as you can see on this slide, it remains in this one. That's because carbon pricing can drive sweeping changes throughout the real economy, and we think it's necessary, though not sufficient, as a tool to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So if you can move to the next slide. So carbon pricing unlocked. We think that mandatory carbon prices are still much too low to incentivize the shifts required. In October last year, the IMF released a report arguing that the global average carbon price needs to be at least $75 a ton to keep warming within acceptable limits. Some argue the necessary price is much higher than that. In the report, the IMF estimated that the current average price is just $2 a ton. Something needs to change quickly. Carbon prices are often considered the reserve of policymakers and regulators, something that's imposed on and happens to businesses and consumers. And we wanted to demonstrate that actually carbon pricing is a tool that companies and governments should be empowered to use to manage their risks, to demonstrate leadership, and also to help avert the climate crisis. These actions can then in turn pave the way for the higher ambition from policymakers and regulators. And next slide. So that's why we partnered with Navigant in 2015 to develop the Carbon Pricing Unlocked series. As you can see in this slide, we looked at 5 different interconnected research topics, including the paper that we'll discuss in more detail today about future-proofing supply chains using internal carbon pricing. Companies looking to reduce their emissions and mitigate climate risk usually start with their own business and operations, which is great, but it's a mistake to stop there. On average, supply chain emissions account for 5 times the direct emissions of a company, which means that the majority of the risks and opportunities associated with climate change are going to be hidden in that supply chain. This paper builds on our previous research and existing tools used to manage supply chains. We developed tools to help procurement professionals use internal carbon pricing to manage climate risk in their supply chains and seize opportunities, which in turn can catalyze low carbon competition and innovation and ultimately accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. And with that, I'll pass to Nikki, who I believe is going to tell you about some of the excellent work that CDP has been doing on supply chain emissions.
Hi there, thank you very much, and thanks very much for joining us. Really a pleasure to have you on the call. From a CDP perspective, supply chains are obviously absolutely critical. Some of the statistics that Grace has just laid out make that totally clear. So if you could go to the next slide for me, please, Long. Great, thank you. You can see here the level to which and the opportunity there is within supply chains. Obviously, in some sectors, much more than others, but roughly an average ratio of 5.5 in terms of direct emissions, scope 1 and 2, versus that which is in the supply chain. Obviously, in the intensive sectors, this becomes less, but very, very clearly in sectors around retail and manufacturing and food, agriculture, etc., supply chain is the absolute key. So it's a real opportunity for companies. It also is where some of their risks from climate change and transition risk will lie. So definitely a clear business case for companies to work on that. We have suppliers, my apologies, big buyers within our system now representing $3 trillion in purchasing power, $3 trillion. And these have had an extraordinary impact on the number of companies disclosing to us, in particular in emerging markets where we've managed to almost triple our disclosure rates in those countries due to the supply chain program. And that big buyers are using the CDP system to both find out the information and the data they need to be able to embed changes across their supply chain, but also to utilize the system to start to standardize some of the things they can be asking and supporting their supply chain to do. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you can see here again how much of the supply chain almost lurks beneath the surface in terms of the emissions there. There are, in 2019, all the suppliers who came through our system reported a combined annual scope 1 and 2 emissions of, almost 8,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents, which is more than the annual greenhouse gas emissions of the US and Canada combined. So a significant proportion of global emissions in those companies. The suppliers themselves also highlighted up to 20 billion in savings from implementing climate change initiatives. However, only less than a third of them have actually reported on reduced emissions. So there's a big, both an opportunity and there's definitely a need to drive the change without the supply chain. So this work comes at a really crucial time. Next slide, please. So I think just a final piece on that in terms of the value of supply chains. This is one of the theories of change we have at CDP in terms of how things can really cascade. You can see through this an example of how you go from you start with the retailers where they are clearly sitting with that 9.5, that 90% almost of all their emissions sitting in their supply chains. But as you cascade through their value chain, you're going to end up with primary manufacturers, and in time you're going to end up with those with high scope 1 and 2 emissions. So essentially, it's a very powerful way to reach right across a value chain to drive for the types of changes we need to see. So a very a powerful way for that change, as I say. Next slide, please. So one of the keys here is we're talking about one of the tools that a company can use to try and drive this change. Internal carbon pricing. We've had a very brief overview on that from Grace, and Long will take us through the very clear steps that they've created in their guide. But just to say, this has been highlighted as a tool by the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, including how to drive change across the value chain of a company and supply chains to reduce costs. And from CDP's perspective, we've seen this grow as a tool within companies. And it's starting to become I would say the growth is of using this for supply chains is beginning now, and really the innovation has only just begun. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of how this has grown, this is the data up until 2017 of CDP's. I'm going to run you through very briefly some of the unpublished 2018 and 2019 as well. We have a new baseline and new system that came through, and so the data is slightly different and not really comparable. But essentially, you can see this extraordinary growth between 2014 to 2017 in terms of companies who use this tool or who are planning to use this tool. Next slide. This we're not going to go through in detail, but just to give you a sense that for certain sectors, it's definitely started in those sectors where they have been directly exposed to carbon pricing policy. So for obvious reasons, you end up with deep penetration of this tool within companies in industries related to high scope 1 and 2 emissions. So energy, utilities, materials, etc. That is, and manufacturing, etc. That makes perfect sense. These are the companies that are directly exposed to the policy. And with supply chain, you're going to start to see that flip, I believe, because you're starting to see companies use it more deliberately to drive change across that supply chain, and you end up closing that loop again across the value chain between the direct and the indirect emissions. Next slide, please. So just to show here, again, not going to go into too much detail, but just to give you a sense, as I've mentioned, this isn't direct, response to direct policy. It is a very rational response by a company. And then we're starting to see this innovation happen. And we're clearly coming through in the disclosures in regions where companies are not yet exposed to direct carbon pricing measures, or there is potentially no policy coming through, or there's no national policy coming through. You are seeing a growth in this tool being used. Countries such as parts of the United States that do not have a system, Japan, India, where you're starting to see companies either A, get ready for this, or B, are starting to deliberately use it, which I think is really valuable for this particular webinar, starting to deliberately use it as a tool to drive down their emissions overall. Next slide, please. So what we've seen, we kind of clump the answers from companies into 3 key boxes, which is companies use this, in a direct response to policy to manage those risks, not just from direct carbon pricing regulation, but also from indirect carbon, which is placing an indirect cost on carbon. Things where you have targets around energy efficiency, you have targets around renewable energy. You have standards coming in, benchmarks coming in for energy performance. Those things do place a proxy price on carbon, and companies are using an internal carbon price to manage that. They're also using it to identify opportunities, And finally, they're using it as a transition tool, which I've already mentioned. And for all of these, I think are applicable to when companies apply it to a supply chain. Next slide, please. So this is a very just pulled through from the disclosure we did very recently for you. It hasn't been published yet, but you can see that supplier engagement. So this is 2019's disclosure. We ask companies to tell us and choose from they can tick as many options as they like from a drop-down list. Why are you doing it? What are your objectives? What are your objectives in setting this carbon price? And you can see supplier engagement is the smallest group that come through with that. And if you go to the next slide, please, you'll see there that again, very much the smallest group. This is showing all the what companies choose and how many companies choose supply chain. So a very small group, but interestingly, that number is going up. So between 2018 and 2019, there's about a 15% increase. So I think we're seeing a trend here. As I mentioned, it's an innovative piece. As the transition tool side of this starts to kick in, I think we're going to see more and more companies innovate, and that's why this guide coming out now is at a perfect time for many companies. Really, really critically, I think the other big thing we noticed was that there's definitely companies use internal carbon pricing for different reasons. As I've mentioned, they also use them in different scopes within the organization. So those companies, obviously, that are focusing on scope 3 as well as 1 and 2 are going to start looking at their supply chains. But we do notice a bit of a gap there, also, some cognitive dissonance, because half the companies who use it for their supply chain who say that they use it for their supply chain are not necessarily yet covering all the scopes within the company. So I think it's definitely a learning for companies right now, and there are some gaps in potentially all the links they are making with that tool, which only makes sense when it comes to innovating and new business practice. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of, of those small group of 60 or so companies who do use it for those reasons, obviously they use it for other reasons too. Where are they based? Now you're starting to see that you're getting the pickup slowly within these other sectors. So infrastructure, retail, apparel, you're going to start seeing that number go up as we start to close that loop. And then I thought I'd include, so next slide, please, just 2 quick pieces where we have pulled out. This one I think is really interesting from a case study we did with AkzoNobel a few years ago, in terms of how they use it. I'm not going to read this all out to you, but essentially it was a really big learning curve. They use an internal carbon price in a variety of ways. They R&D budget to drive change within capital investments, but they also really use it with their suppliers. They are a big buyer, right? So it's significant the impact they could have. And they're first just using it as a learning tool for their suppliers. And then in time, this will become a criteria for, which suppliers they choose. And suppliers at first didn't, as you can see, they didn't really take it seriously, but that's beginning to change now. And I think that kind of forefront behavior, we're going to start seeing more normalized, hopefully, as companies embed this type of behavior. Next slide. Just another quick quote from another company in the disclosure process, where, again, I think this is and Long might just refer to this, one of the ways in which companies use this is to educate their supply chain. So you start, phase 1 is literally about getting the supply chain to understand the risk around carbon and placing in a monetary singular on that, which I think is one of the values that it can provide. And of course, from there, you move into actually making decisions based on it. I'm going to hand over to Long now so he can run us through some of the great work they did in this guide, and we'll have questions at the end.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you very much, Nikki. Yes. So, my name is Long Lam. I'm a managing consultant at Navigant. We are part of Guidehouse. And for the ones who do not know us, we have the largest dedicated energy and sustainability practice, and we have extensive experience on carbon pricing. We are supporting the World Bank on their annual state and trends of carbon pricing report, as well as has published several papers on internal carbon pricing together with the Generation Foundation and CDP. And this brought us to, let's say, the next key topic that we found, that internal carbon pricing I think, should play a large role in future-proofing supply chains. But the thing is, as Nikki has already shown, there are not that many organizations using internal carbon pricing for supply engagement, and even fewer are publicly disclosing that they are. And this is also what we came across in our research for the paper. So we ran an online consultation and held several workshops with procurement professionals, primarily in the Netherlands, to find out what are the main barriers for using internal carbon pricing for procurement or supply chain management. And what we found was that it was not due to a lack of interest, but primarily due to a lack of information about how it can be used and what value it can bring. This, together with other barriers, contribute to the perception that ICP could be costly and complex to implement. These other barriers include limited visibility on control over supply chain emissions, having many and very diverse suppliers, and the disconnection between procurement and sustainability departments, and legal uncertainties. So with this new paper, we hope to tackle some of these barriers and inspire more organizations to consider internal carbon pricing for future-proofing their supply chain. Because the use of internal carbon pricing in procurement supply chain management could bring various benefits. By assigning a monetary value to the carbon footprint of what your organization buys, so a carbon price, you basically translate climate change and greenhouse gas emissions into something that everyone understands, money. And you can use it to incorporate climate impacts into your financial decisions, or to show climate leadership and strengthen your brand value, provide more insights on the carbon cost risks in your supply chain, or discover new incentives and new opportunities for low carbon innovation, and use it as a metric to assess your suppliers. And because with internal carbon pricing, you're not talking about money instead of emissions and how it can affect decisions that are being made, it could also be a stronger incentive for suppliers to provide more accurate carbon footprint data for the products that they offer. Or it also can make procurement and supply chain management more important in your organization and increase the interest for buyers and suppliers to learn and help each other to reduce emissions. But these are only some of the main benefits that internal carbon pricing could bring. And which benefits you want to achieve will then ultimately form the objectives of your internal carbon pricing program. So after you know what you want to achieve with internal carbon pricing, the next step is then how. Also, as Nikki briefly and Grace briefly mentioned, in 2017, we published a how-to guide to internal carbon pricing, so with the Generation Foundation CDP, where we break down the complexity of internal carbon pricing into 4 dimensions and provide a step-by-step guidance for developing and implementing internal carbon pricing. So with this new briefing paper by Navigant and the Generation Foundation, it builds on this 4D framework and focuses primarily on the design step, tailoring it to procurement and supply chain management so that it can be embedded in existing practices. And in the rest of this webinar, I will just share some of the highlights of a new paper on how to choose products and materials for ICP, how to determine the most suitable approach for integrating internal carbon pricing in your decision-making process, how to set the carbon price, and how continuously to improve your ICP program to ensure it keeps having impact. So the first step for designing an ICP program for procurement supply chain management is to identify which parts of the supply chain are most suitable for ICP. Also, to help practitioners in choosing suitable products and materials, we started with the traditional project matrix that most procurement professionals are familiar with. So by mapping what is purchased against their financial importance to the organization and how difficult it is to buy, products and materials can be divided into 4 categories. So you have the non-critical items. These are items that can easily buy and are negligible in the finances of your organization. For example, disposable coffee cups. Then you have leverage items, which are financially significant, but there are also a lot of suppliers to choose from. So it's worth investing some resources in selecting these suppliers. On the other side of the matrix, then you have bottleneck items. This is where generally your bargaining position is weak, as there are not that many suppliers for that product. But their costs are also not financially significant to invest a lot of resources in improving this bargaining position. And finally, there are strategic items. These are financially crucial to organization with limited choice in terms of suppliers. So these generally get a lot of attention. Well, by adding the internal carbon pricing element, we adapted this CrowdJig matrix to map out purchases against their financial risks and opportunities that their potential carbon costs could bring to the organization, and how complex it is to switch to lower carbon alternatives for these purchases. What this then shows that generally for leverage and strategic items, these are most suitable for internal carbon pricing, because the financial importance of these products and materials could make it worth investing the resources in setting up an ICP program. For bottleneck items, ITCP could also be applicable, but given the weak bargaining position, the options are much more limited. And for non-critical items, you most likely don't need ICP, as their carbon cost impact would be so small, and there are sufficient lower carbon alternatives to directly choose from without any use of pricing tools. So while this ICP adapted CrowdJig matrix is a helpful starting point in choosing the scope of your ICP program, it doesn't really capture all the relevant factors when considering suitability for internal carbon pricing. So other factors could include the internal culture and objectives of your organization and your suppliers, or external factors outside of your control, such as government regulation. So understanding the factors that could influence the suitability of internal carbon pricing for different products and materials is key. So when you know what you want to include in your ICP program, you need to decide how it could influence your purchasing decisions for these products and materials. Well, internal carbon pricing could be applied to internal processes. For example, integrating it as a cost in risk assessment for supplier prices, or as a levy on procurement departments based on the carbon footprints of the products that they buy. But ICP could also be applied to influence behavior of suppliers. And the most suitable internal carbon price approach will vary per type of purchase. Since the purchasing strategy generally depends on the item category, also here the CrowdJig matrix can be used again. So for leverage items, generally tenders are being used. So internal carbon pricing could be used as part of scoring bids, or adding the carbon footprint of offered products to the financial assessment of bids. For strategic items, many organizations tend to establish long-term relationships with suppliers, and internal carbon pricing could be used to financially support suppliers reducing their emissions, or the use of internal carbon pricing by suppliers could be added as a condition for prolonging partnerships. With bottleneck items, the bargaining power is much more limited, so are the variations in the ICP approaches. So internal carbon pricing could be used, for example, to determine the premium the organization is willing to pay for low carbon products. So in the paper, we go into much more detail in each of these approaches, some illustrative examples. And Dadi will also dive into some of these approaches they have been thinking about at Landsverken in his presentation. And then there's setting the carbon price. Well, most organizations actually tend to start with this question, what the price to use should be in their ICP program. But that's like building a house without a foundation, because what the price to use is depends on what you want to achieve with your ICP program. So if it's incorporating climate change in your decision, you should use a price that reflects the impact of climate change, for example, the potential cost and damages to your supply chain. If it's about showing climate leadership, the price should be high enough to steer decisions towards low carbon ones. For insights into risks of carbon costs, the carbon price should reflect future policy and market developments. If your ICP program is designed to drive low carbon innovation, the price used in your decision needs to be high enough to incentivize this innovation. And if you want to use ICP as an additional metric to assess suppliers, you need a carbon price that actually allows you to distinguish suppliers based on the carbon footprint of their offerings. This means that the most ideal carbon price for every organization is unique, and there's not one single best carbon price. So you can have different carbon prices also in your ICP program, depending on the objectives. And in practice, there could also be other constraints, such as government regulations or acceptance internally and amongst suppliers. So that is why, in the end, implementing internal carbon pricing is a dynamic and iterative approach, as ultimately you're trying to change behavior and decisions. So it's important to have the backing of senior management and involve all key stakeholders and suppliers from the start. But even then you will face resistance. So that's why it's good to just start with the most promising products and materials and an internal carbon pricing approach and a price that internal stakeholders and suppliers are comfortable with, but still strong enough to have some impact. Because then with some more experience and evidence of the benefits, you can then ramp up the impact of your ICP program. But no matter how your program for procurement or supply chain management is designed, it's important that in the end you also have some form of monitoring and enforcement. This is not only to see how the program is performing for your own reporting or how it could be improved, but also to ensure that suppliers deliver what they promised, because you have less visibility and control over their actions. Because the main thing you want to avoid is that you enter into a contract with suppliers where ICP was a deciding factor and deliver something else. Because as many of you have experienced, it's really frustrating to get not to get what you have paid for. And you can find many more details in the paper. But for now, I will hand over to Dadi from Networking to take us into some of the practical examples and experience that they have on internal carbon pricing.
Right. Thank you, Long. Greetings to you all. I'm Dadi, the project manager for carbon pricing in Landsvirkjun, the national power company of Iceland. And we welcome this opportunity to share with you our carbon pricing journey. Next slide, please. The next one, please. Here is the overview of my presentation, starting with a brief introduction of Landsvirkjun. I will then explain our target of carbon neutrality and our implementation of internal carbon pricing. And to finalize, I'll explain our increased focus on using carbon pricing to lower emissions in our supply chain and how this report has helped us map the process and identify where we could focus our efforts. Next slide, please. Our home country of Iceland is located in the North Atlantic. Although my country provides a lot of the scenery in the Game of Thrones, Lost in Space, and other Hollywood adventures where outlandish landscapes are required, we would also like to be known as the land of renewable energy. A large part of our supply chain comes from renewable natural resources. Our hydropower is renewed annually by snow and rain and meltwater from glaciers. Our geothermal power plants get their power from heat generated by volcanic activity and abundant wind that we've only recently begun to exploit. Next slide, please. Landsvirkjun provides over 70% of energy in Iceland, which is also 100% renewable. And this map shows the location of our power stations. Most are hydro plants, indicated with a blue color. We have a few geothermal power plants in the northeast, indicated by orange. And indicated with the color gray, you can see our power-intensive customers, which include major aluminum companies, metal industries, and data centers. Next bullet, please. Our net carbon footprint is 1.9 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is considered low, but we're still determined to further lowering our carbon footprint to less than 0. Next slide, please. Our climate action was globally declared in 2015, where we set ourselves the target of reaching carbon neutrality by 2030. This target was later updated in 2019 to be reached by the end of 2025. And we also decided to adopt an internal carbon price to support this target. Next slide, please. In order to reach our target of carbon neutrality, we needed comprehensive data on our carbon footprint to accurately map out our emissions, carbon offsets, and sequestration measures. And this graph shows how our carbon footprint was determined in 2018, and that our largest source of emissions comes from geothermal power, almost 40,000 tons a year, as shown by the far left column. This is due to the fact that some, but not all, geothermal reservoirs can contain significant amounts of greenhouse gases that are emitted when the pressurized naturally hot water is released as steam. To a much lesser degree, our hydropower reservoirs and organic CO2 also contribute to our carbon footprint. Our sequestration efforts, indicated in the orange color, are mostly carried out by carbon removal with tree plantations. Next slide, please. Next important step was to map out our options in reducing direct emissions. And the pie chart in the top right corner shows that over 93% of our emissions are direct emissions within Scope 1, and 7% are indirect emissions within Scope 3. And during this work, we identified 35 abatement options within 5 categories, and quickly saw that the most potential was to be found within our geothermal power plants, over 36,000 tons in annual emission reduction. As can be seen, land use sequestration has almost unlimited potential for abatement, but we prefer to prevent new emissions and reduce current emissions instead of implementing mitigation measures whenever possible. And this process helped us map out where to focus our emission reduction efforts and the magnitude of abatement by 2030. As can be seen in the table on the bottom right, we have also set targets of emission reduction by 2030 for various categories. And we decided it was a reasonable target to reduce emissions within geothermal power by 60%, contributing significantly towards the 50% reduction in Scope 1 emissions. That was also the focus for our carbon price level, to make it sufficiently high to support these necessary investments. Next slide, please. We decided to implement our internal carbon price in steps, seeking senior management approval for each milestone of the project. This cut down our task from being almost overwhelming to become quite manageable. It also greatly helped that our project had great support from senior management from the start. After each milestone had been approved, we could plan the next phase of the project. And our first milestone in early 2018 was recognizing that internal carbon pricing was an effective tool to support decision-making in reaching carbon neutrality. We then decided to adopt an internal carbon price based temporarily on the market price in the EU ETS system. We then started a project in the autumn to identify 35 abatement options that I described on the previous slide, their costs and benefits, which allowed us to build a marginal abatement cost curve, and also calculate what carbon price was needed to reach carbon neutrality. And then in March 2019, we received approval for a carbon price of $30 per ton for 2019. And the next phase was implementing the use of our carbon price within the company, with management approval of procedures and protocols, which included the finance department taking ownership of the carbon price. We also created a handbook for ICP use and required every department using the carbon price to create spreadsheet models for how the carbon price would be used for decision making and how the calculation would be performed. And every stakeholder within our company is required to submit written documentation annually how the carbon price was used and provide evidence how it affected the decision making. And we updated our internal carbon price annually, and in December 2019, we approved a $33 carbon price for 2020. Next slide, please. And this is our plan for reaching carbon neutrality by end of the year 2025. Next bullet, please. We're going to do it by increasing sequestration measures. Next slide, please. We're going to lower emissions from geothermal power and other sources too. And then we will effectively reach the target in 2025. We also need sufficient sequestration buffers that I will explain better later to accommodate increases in Scope 3 emissions during the construction of new power plants and maintenance of power plants. Next slide, please. And here is the main topic of the agenda. My company will focus efforts in 2020 in reducing Scope 3 emissions. Despite Scope 3 emissions being a small portion of our annual business as usual emissions, we do see an increase in these emissions during the construction of new power plants. A new medium-sized power plant can easily increase our gross emissions by 25 to 33% during the construction period. We are therefore interested in reducing these emissions as much as possible by intervening early in the design process, identifying greener alternatives, engaging our contractors and value chain, and increasing their climate awareness, and also using internal carbon prices to help us in this. Next slide, please. And here we have the ICP adapted Krailchik matrix that Long showed us in his presentation. And we used it as a starting point to identify the initial scope of our our ICP approach for procurement and supply chain management. Next bullet, please. A large source of our Scope 3 emissions is the construction of new power plants and power plant maintenance. And during the design stage, the choice of materials, location, architecture, etc., significantly influences the carbon footprint of the construction project. Also, during the construction and procurement stage, the choice of construction methods, fuel choice, etc., by contractors and the carbon footprint of suppliers will affect Scope 3 emissions. So items A and B represent our power stations, our source of revenue, and therefore have great impact on our profitability. And we therefore place the items A and B in strategic items. Items C and D, next step, choice of fertilizer and vehicle fuel are therefore responsible for a small portion of our annual emissions. And we found it relatively easy to find lower carbon alternatives. And we therefore categorize them as non-critical. The final items involve the choice of cement, which is a subset of items A and B. Cement does have a significant carbon footprint during construction, but obtaining a low carbon alternative can be problematic. Our calculations show that the required carbon price for choosing low carbon cement had to be unrealistically high compared to other much cheaper alternative ways of lowering emissions. Also, fuel use has a small impact on our total emissions, and current technology might rule out greener alternatives, at least for the time being. So we therefore classified these items as bottleneck items. However, it should be noted that we have made it our official target to reduce our purchases of fossil fuels by 99% by 2030. Next slide, please. So we've decided to focus on strategic items and bottleneck items. And next, please. So as we want to maintain and develop a long-term supply relationship to ensure continuity of supply, we are interested in gradual adjustment in engaging our supply chain. Next, please. So we haven't decided to what degree this gradual adjustment should be, but we are considering 3 stages. So in stage 1, we could include a carbon price to show the effect on bid ranking, but not use it to choose the lowest bid. And in stage 2, we could use a partial weight. And finally, in stage 3, we could use the internal carbon price fully. Next, please. Of course, we would need standardized LCA data from officially recognized sources for this to be effective. And next, please. Regarding the bottleneck items, we are considering that it can become more relevant once carbon neutrality is achieved in 2025. Next, please. So the focus could then shift to maintain carbon neutrality beyond 2025. Next, please. Which could involve a trade-off where we need to ensure sufficient sequestration buffers to absorb Scope 3 emissions during the power plant construction, or finding a premium for lower carbon materials and products for power plant construction. Next, please. So we do wish to engage our suppliers in a way that will get them on board in reducing our emissions. And we are currently looking into performing a preliminary market consultation that is permitted within the EU Utilities Directive. This would allow us to open up dialogue with our suppliers and also get to know low carbon products and services without actual procurement. At the same time, we could introduce a potential rating criteria for selecting bids and how internal carbon pricing could be used in procurement. Next slide, please. So I would really like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have during the panel discussion. So thank you.
Gaudi, thank you very much, and Nikki Drayton, thank you very much for your presentations as well. Just to reiterate, if you have a question to ask the panel, then please do enter the question section of the control panel within the screen. I'm very pleased to say that I don't have to exercise my normal moderator's prerogative and ask the questions to start with. We already have a full set of questions coming in. First of which is from Dr. Joseph Nyang'o, and the question is focused towards Nikki, but I think others will be able to answer this as well. The question is, how is the internal carbon pricing tool being used by companies to improve operational and behavioural practices that pose environmental risks in performance measurement and benchmarking to accelerate sustainability? Nikki, I don't know if you're ready to start with, and others can please weigh in as they feel fit.
Sure. So this is more, I'm assuming, I'm just clarifying, this is much more in a much more broader sense than just for supply chains, right?
I believe so, but I think that given the focus of the panel has been on supply chains, I think if we can touch on the answer, that would be great. They've also asked if there are any examples of using ITP in this way, but I think it's the question is broader.
Great. Okay, so I think there are many answers to this question in terms of the ways in which companies are innovating in this space. As I've already mentioned, one of them is a very rational response to an external policy environment, and is essentially internalizing that cost to the business. But many companies, when they are doing that, are actually obviously recognizing that it is not just today's price that matters, that many of their CapEx decisions have long-term consequences. And so they are creating and modeling ways in which that is either as a shadow price, but is actually having a really big impact. So it's a decision, it has an impact and an influence on decisions by either being a threshold mechanism in CapEx and investment project decision making. That's one way that companies are doing this, but they are obviously using a price that either changes over time, or is actually already quite high, so as to reflect any changes that may happen in the next 10 years within a geography, given that the return on investment on certain assets is quite a long time when it comes to big infrastructure projects, for example. So that's one way that we've seen it happen, and we see disclosure of companies highlighting that when they have it, it's less about the number and much more about the influence it has and who actually embeds this. Very much the senior team or the CFO is a good example, the finance officer, the chief finance officer. If they pick this up, that has a big influence, and if it becomes a sort of threshold mechanism, it has actually changed quite a significant number of decisions. And we'll be publishing a report very soon, which will have some of these examples and some of the numbers updates to look out for that to come out in the next 2 months. Then we see companies use this, as I've mentioned, to identify opportunities. We also see them, one of the ways in which they do that is through their R&D budgets. So companies have looked out to the future, have done their integrating their climate risk and opportunities into their mainstream reporting, and they've seen in the analysis that actually the low carbon future is one in which it is worth investing in, and therefore they've realized that their R&D budget needs to be almost not necessarily exclusively, but almost exclusively focused in that area of innovation. Obviously there are other areas of innovation, but for certain companies that's a key area. And so they have a higher price. So they have different prices for different reasons. So that same company that might have used it for a CapEx decision for investments, they may use a different price, which is much higher, to actually justify the investment within their R&D budget, so that they in the future can realize that opportunity. If the price was this high, given that in 10 years' time that R&D will come to fruition, what does that look like for us? Oh, good, it looks like an opportunity. We're therefore going to have a much bigger allocation within our R&D budget. And then you have the companies that use it deliberately to drive behavior. And there's a variety of ways that they do this. So they're not just trying to manage direct policy risk. They're not just seeking those opportunities. They're actually saying, we have set ourselves a target. Often this is a science-based target. We want to develop and use tools to drive that change to align with that target. Then they stress test various options, and they discover that for their sector, well, it's also the corporate culture that matters. They work out that for this sector, this scope of emissions, an internal carbon price could really make a difference. And actually for energy efficiency projects, we might just change our return on investment. It all depends on the company, the culture, the buy-in from the senior management. But using it as a deliberate tool to align and achieve their targets is very much emerging practice. I would say it's not the norm yet. I would say it's less than a quarter of companies who do that. but certainly where that edge is in terms of innovation and leadership. In terms of just finally, take a look online at our data portal, the carbon pricing data portal. You'll find reports there with all the previous examples and case studies, and we'll be updating that, as I say, in the next 2 months, and you'll see the latest from companies. So do take a look at that. Thank you.
Nikki, thank you. I'm conscious we have a lot of questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group the themes of the questions together and ask them to one or two of the panelists together. There's a clutch of questions come in around the price that's used within ICP. One being from Peter Daring being, is it not quite simply the cheapest way to remove a ton of carbon from the atmosphere? There's a question to Dadi on the $30 a ton price, and whether that is efficient. And there's a question on whether there are standardized prices that could be used and accessed for people looking at this as an option. So I'm going to ask Long and Dadi if you can respond to those, essentially talking a little bit around how prices are set and why and how successful they've been within the practical example of Dadi's.
Okay, if I can start a bit. The prices that we set ourselves in Landsvirkjun represents the opportunities that we mapped out of reducing our emissions. So when we mapped out those opportunities, we did that by finding data that for decades into the future for each opportunity, for the costs and the benefits. So we ended up with several bundles that we looked at that would allow us to reach carbon neutrality by the time that we set ourselves. And you could say that our carbon price represents a certain budget that we have available to financing the necessary investments to reach the carbon neutrality target. So Long, if you can add something to that.
Yes, for sure. And I think you also reflects of what also mentioned is that the price of your internal carbon pricing approach really depends on what you want to achieve with it. Because one question was about whether the internal carbon price is not simply the cheapest way to remove a ton of CO2 from the atmosphere. Well, in theory, if there was a global market and everyone participating and there would be no objections, yes, probably that's theoretically the cheapest way. But the thing with offsets is, from a country perspective, you'll be sending money abroad. So then there are issues there. From a company perspective, then buying offsets is not necessarily affecting a lot of your decisions. Because if your goal is to do risk management, to prepare yourself for future carbon pricing regulation, and the price of offsets does not reflect that, then the ideal way to set the price is to estimate, okay, how much would I potentially pay in the future under the carbon pricing system, for example, the EU emissions trading system or a carbon tax. That's the best way for risk mitigation then. Or if you have a science-based targets, they don't allow offsets to be counted in your reaching the target. So then you would, with offset prices, you would not really reflect the effort needed to reach that target that you have set. So in the end, all the prices, they depend on what your objectives are. So you could indeed do a whole technical analysis. You could also find external sources. There are various sources that say what the carbon price should be to be able to meet the Paris Agreement. Some of these sources take into account other complementary policies. Some sources don't take into other complementary policies, but you can find a lot of them. I think on the website of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, there are some. There's a good starting point to find these sources.
Long, Dadi, thank you for that. The other set of questions which are grouping together, which there's a common theme, is around the use of ICP in the finance sector with central banks and with investment banks. Questions around whether we have drawn on the experience of the World Bank within this analysis, and also whether ICP can be aligned with LCA guidelines. I know this is a subject of one of the other papers that we produced, but Grace, would you like to say anything on that, just in terms of the alignment with some of the developments and the finance sector, and perhaps Long, you might be able to add to it from the experience of the other papers.
Yeah, I can pipe in a little bit on that. I think, you know, one thing to say is to point to the other paper that we wrote on internal carbon pricing for financial institutions. But if you look at some of the things that are coming out from both the TCFD and some of the members of the Network for Greening the Financial System, you know, internal carbon pricing is mentioned as one of the mechanisms that can be used in order to assess your risk in the future and gain a better awareness of the financial risks associated with climate change coming into the future beyond just kind of, you know, a more basic assessment. It gives you a tool to really look more deeply through the different investments that you might have, and a tool to kind of aggregate all sorts of different information coming from a variety of companies that might fit into, say, a portfolio. So a kind of, you know, common denominator to give you a better portfolio assessment of your climate risk. It's not a perfect measure, but it's much better than often what people are using at the moment. But I'll let Long elaborate on that point.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And because one of the issues that generally faced is, okay, what kind of emissions are then taken into account, or which indeed the question was also what LCA guidelines to follow then, which is also what the financial sector is struggling with carbon footprinting. And of course, there are loads of different ways, and it's slowly improving, but it still takes time to improve. And ideally for suppliers, for investors, it's good to have standardized guidelines, because then at least when you're making decisions on these would be sort of a level playing field in terms of emissions, because ultimately you want to reduce emissions with internal carbon pricing as well. Because we're moving towards a low carbon world. But it takes time, so it's you should not let that be a limiting factor, and that's why internal carbon pricing is a whole iterative approach. When more data becomes available, when LCA guidelines become better, then of course you should certainly look at them, certainly when they're standardized. But in the meantime, a lot of action can already be taken.
Long, thank you very much. I'm conscious that we're very much nearing the top of the hour. We have had a series of questions which have come in, which some of which are a little bit sort of off topic, so I'm going to park those. So I would turn to the group and just say, are there any final comments from your side before we wrap up? Otherwise, I will say my closing remarks. I'm assuming not, as no one's there. So I would say thank you very much, everybody, for joining the session. There are I've seen a number of questions come through around availability of resources, both for this particular topic and some of the other CPU guides. All the guides are available, including the how-to guides that will help organisations establish internal carbon pricing. They should be available on our website, and I believe on Generation Foundations. I should apologise, we are just going through the process of amending our website. So I think some of those, the links may not be working, so many apologies. One of the comments seems to have been that the links wasn't working. So we will check that and distribute the links to the attendees afterwards. I would hope we can distribute the slides, but I do need to check with the panelists just to make sure that there isn't anything there that they don't want sharing more broadly. So just to wrap up, thank you again all very much for joining. If you have got further questions, please do contact the contact details there, cpu@navigant.com, and we will endeavour to answer them as we go forward. So thank you very much. I will now close the call and hope to speak to you all again soon. Bye bye.
All right, thank you. Bye.